Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to the I Have the Right to Aspire podcast. I'm Katie, and I'm here with my co-host, Chessie. Aspire was created by the nonprofit I Have the Right To, which Chessie co-founded and where I serve as executive director, as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. This podcast is about learning together, leaning into courage, and uplifting the voices of people who show up every day to drive real, lasting change. Before we jump into our conversation with today's guests, we want to take a moment to introduce two of our guest co-hosts who will be joining us for this episode. Chessie, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Maria and Kylie.
I'm especially excited today to introduce Maria, I Have the Right to Communications Director, into this conversation with Lauren. Maria leads the organization's social media presence and marketing strategies, but she also holds a law degree and a master's in intellectual property law. Alongside her legal and advocacy work, Maria discovered a love for graphic design and marketing, and she is now dedicated to amplifying the organization's message.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to join this conversation.
We're also so excited to be joined by Kylie Laboutier, a student at the College of Charleston. Kylie came to I Have the Right To with a strong passion for advocacy and community support, and she hopes to extend that same care and guidance to students and communities beyond her campus. Welcome, Kylie.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
And now I'm going to pass it over to Katie to introduce today's guest, Lauren Weingarten.
Thanks, Chessie, and welcome again, Maria and Kylie. We're honored to be joined today by Lauren Weingarten. Lauren is a survivor, victim advocate, trauma support specialist, and community builder. She is the voice and founder of MTMV Community Support Network, one of the first social media-based support communities established for survivors and supporters of survivors. Her work has shaped how we talk about trauma and sexual violence online. She is passionate about community as justice and leading conversations surrounding mental health, trauma, and survivor-informed care. Let's dive in. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We are so happy to have you here and to be having this conversation today. So, for some of our listeners who may be meeting you for the first time, how do you like to introduce yourself and the work you do with MTMV Community Support Network?
Well, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I think you covered a lot of it. I'll share a little bit more about MTMV. MTMV offers peer support, groups, workshops, consulting, events, and resources for individuals impacted by trauma, abuse, and sexual violence, and those who support them across the globe. We also connect individuals with resources aimed at enhancing mental health and overall well-being. They like to say that community is our culture. What that means is, we work both directly with survivors and those who support them. We have various support groups, one-on-one support, a lot of workshops, community events, working with both survivors and organizations, institutions that serve the survivor community all over the world.
MTMB was one of the first social media based support communities for survivors and their supporters. I would love to hear you talk about the story behind it. What was happening in your life and in the world when you decided that this was a space that needed to exist?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was March of 2019. And so MTMV is almost 7 years old. Happy almost birthday. At the time, I was still very much trying to process my own assault and felt very isolated. Um, but as alone and confused as I felt, I'm very stubborn, and I thought that there must be other people going through what I was going in their own pockets of the world. It's always this combination of it's very sobering and validating how right I turned out to be about that. I just didn't expect MTMV to grow to what it has. When I first started MTMV, I was anonymous for the first year or so, just growing more confidence. Um, when I first started MTMV, it was called Me Too, Many Voices, as in Me Too, Many Voices, but also Me Too Many Voices. At the time, I did not know about Tarana Burke's rich history, building communities for Black girls under the moniker of Me Too, which is one of the reasons why I have now switched to MTMV Community Support Network. As I mentioned, I was running the account anonymously, still working on my own healing journey. And meanwhile, I was taking classes, workshops, trainings, and understanding trauma in the body and dismantling these abuse myths that are so prevalent in our society became a big catalyst in my own journey. And that education just kind of helped me understand and was like, okay, I'm not crazy. I make sense. This makes sense. And I wanted to share that information, and here we are.
I love the emphasis that you put on community in the creation of the MTMV social media community, in what you do for survivors and their supporters in total. I think it's so important to build community over an issue that we're told to be quiet about so often. And so much of this harm just grows like bacteria in darkness and silence. And so it's incredible, and it's always really joyful when I see a MTMV post come up on my Instagram feed. Like, the colors are joyful, the content is often joyful and supportive, while calling out the harm that happens in societies. And so I'd love to hear from you. Why did you choose to create the community in this way, with the bright colors, with the collaborations? What were you seeing that was lacking from survivor communities that existed online, the very few that did? And, I could talk with you for hours about the way that you are doing such radical work with the impact that social media has on young people today, and the types of communities that tend to thrive on social media. So I just want to thank you for the way that you're combating the toxicity that often just tends to bloom on social media, and would love to hear how you got there in the first place with what type of content you produce.
Well, first off, thank you so much, especially coming from somebody that I just have so much respect for, and the work that you have done in your book. Like, I don't know what's the earliest somebody has ever cried on your podcast? Like, I wanna-
Before the recording starts, I
uh,
typically cry.
fair
Mhm.
enough. No, truly, thank you. And thank you for that question. um, I think the big thing is community and solidarity and that connection. I could not find the resources that I wanted or needed. And well, I didn't necessarily realize it so much at the time. I wasn't alone in that. Um, After I was assaulted, I lost my entire community. I lost my job. My life as I knew it changed, and I was incredibly isolated. So I didn't really have that quote unquote in real life community. And as I mean, there's never enough support for survivors. And, even we're talking about 7 years ago, there was even less than there is now. And I wanted to create something. I kept thinking a lot of folks, we've said me too. So what's next? How can we find connection? How can we find support for people who do want to know how to support survivors, or a survivor being able to log on and say, "Oh, wait, like I get that. Yeah, that's me." Like, that makes sense. And there's just that having that mutuality is so healing. Um and I'm really proud that I am one of the folks who have shaped the framework for these online spaces. And I think that the internet and social media has made resources much more accessible for many. I work with folks all over the world. My last community craft night, we had people from 3 different continents. I'm like, that's amazing. Um, and this statistic, which I did not realize at the time, but something I talk a lot about in my trainings and that I just kind of marvel at is I'm going to read this. 71% of Instagram users are under the age of 35. And per RAIN, 69% of sexual assault victims are under the age of 34. With that fact alone, social media is just such a logical fit. And, the numbers increase for survivors of color, LGBTQIA survivors, disabled survivors. And often the most marginalized communities rely on online support, more, just in general. And whether we like it or not, social media has become such a fabric of our society and it's meeting people where they are. I know I would rather search hashtags and try to get information than go into like a cold clinical information. I know that I would rather, be on my couch in my comfy, searching hashtags, looking up, accessible, just information that's meeting me where I'm at than going to kind of a cold clinical building without any preparation. That was long.
You really did do such a remarkable job with fostering a community and connection on social media. So thank you for that. And I just want to ask, you often say more than trauma informed, survivor informed. What does survivor informed care mean to you in practice, and how does it show up in your day to day work?
Thank you for that question. Um, let's start with what is trauma informed care? Trauma informed, trauma responsive care is an approach that recognizes, understands, and responds to the effects of trauma on individuals, systems, and organizations. That's from the Attachment and Trauma Network. And trauma informed care embraces the principles such as safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues, and being mindful to try not to add further traumatization. Survivor informed care builds upon those fundamentals. Um, there's so many different types of trauma, and it's important for working with certain populations who've experienced certain types of trauma to have additional skills. Um, the work that I do, builds upon the foundation that survivors are the experts. That's definitely the core component of survivor informed care. And using that as a principle in the building of the community and the work that you're doing. I try to actionize survivor trauma informed care by I gather feedback and engage in organizational reflection. I ask for consent before direct messaging survivor accounts. I provide agreements for community as spaces and aims to have more clear expectations. Um, each group may have a different set of agreements because it's not one size fits all. Provide information and education without pressuring any given actions or agenda. Um, Offer free to sliding scale rates and aims to make support and resources more accessible. Um, Try to acknowledge the systemic and institutional harm around us. Speaking of harm, you know, we're all capable of causing harm, acknowledging that even with the best intentions, unintentional harm can be caused and making intentional efforts to address and repair that. Um, so many things, prioritizing ethics over online algorithms, asking how a community member would like to be referred, identified. I think that this work happens so much in the smaller moments.
And I think that so much of your work is within the online space, and clearly social media has completely revolutionized the way that survivors approach the subject. And many survivors have complicated relationships with online spaces themselves, and the conversations as a whole can happen so quickly and in so many ways that it's very hard to navigate boundaries, capacity, safety, and as you said, not make content that re-traumatize and makes the survivor go through the same process again. So I guess my question is, what have you learned about doing your work within this social media and digital space? How can you make it as supportive as possible? What are the sort of things that someone that works in the space has to keep in mind? Um, and how do you yourself navigate your own boundaries while still showing up in a public way?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing would be clear boundaries and communication. Um, Especially for survivors, the not knowing, not having information rarely bodes well. um, I would say consistency is a big one. Consistency, but also being flexible. Survivors have to come before system needs. Um, we don't get to decide what safety looks like for somebody else, but we can aim to create accessible content and create environments where folks feel respected and heard, using inclusive language. I think speaking to current events, we don't survive in a vacuum. Um, I think a lot of patience, correcting misinformation or trolls in the comments. Um, Building online communities is not just about posting content. You need to moderate those spaces. I think that's a big one where um, I think people don't know that, understand, or haven't quite caught on to that second half. And you see that. And whether it's deleting trolls or challenging that misinformation and then blocking them, supporting the survivors in the comments. There's more to it than after you hit okay post. Continuing to build that foundation of trust. As second part of your question, setting boundaries. I try to be transparent in my profile highlights. I have, community agreements. You know, it can be hard, especially when folks are coming from so many different places. Having those agreements for the space can help us kind of come to the space, with similar expectations and being able to point to that. I try to balance. Okay, I've been online a lot. Like I need to turn off my phone, especially when current event, the news, survivor stories can be so activating to our systems and just a barrage of them, putting limits on that. Um, I love what I do. And sometimes I find like, okay, like this is stressing me out. And it's like, okay, that is a sign for me to put my phone down, go walk my dog. um, really trying to model. Um, I find that doing the work that I do day in, day out, kind of an unexpected perk of it is when you're telling folks to, self care and, practice all these different things day in and day out. It's hard not to do that yourself because would become almost hypocritical.
It's so interesting, working with students, we often do digital safety workshops. And I think when we think of young people in online spaces, we often think of all the negative things that can happen, or at least I did, because in my, former career, I was representing young people when things went wrong online. But really, community is such a beautiful thing, and online spaces are where we're seeing a lot of survivors get their power back. There's a lot of pressure that they've been able to apply that I think that in the past it would have been a lot harder to apply had it not been for these online communities. So I know you've described community as a form of justice, and I'd love for you to talk about that because I couldn't agree more. I think finding our community and working together is often when, if not always, when we get justice. So I'd like for you to talk about, what community as justice looks like in real everyday moments, and also, how that idea emerged.
Um, Talking about community as justice is literally like one of my favorite hobbies. So, thank you for that question. Um, I think a lot about how society just has generally has conflated ideas of what justice looks like, and it's not what people think. Much of what is offered as justice for survivors, it's not accessible, it's not attainable, it's prohibitively expensive, many obstacles, and most of the systems set up to support survivors are racist, misogynistic, antiquated systems that center the perpetrators. We're working on it. We're working on that change, and there has been change, but they're still not built for survivors. And the majority of survivors out there won't have a day in court or have their survivor story go viral. And the sad truth is that many survivors don't even have access to support care, sometimes even housing. And while it can certainly help, all the guilty verdicts, against the perpetrator in the world aren't a substitute for the healing process. And survivors just get to decide what justice looks like for them. And I know for me, finding community, finding people who get it is probably the closest thing to justice that I'll ever get. And I have heard from many survivors who feel the same way. Um, in a society that isolates and denigrates survivors, community is justice. There's a reason why perpetrators and enablers try to isolate survivors so much because they know just how powerful community is. And I think that how that plays out is sometimes maybe justice is having a horrible week and connecting with a group of peers who truly sees you. They marvel at all you have endured, have been subjected to, and you're still here. And they remind you that they're rooting for you. Maybe it's going on a podcast with folks you admire and connecting that way. Um, I think that it's really important to find justice in everyday moments, especially when so many traditional systems have failed survivors. And as we have seen and continue to see the power of survivor community, we're pretty unstoppable. So watch out.
So you've just done two very concrete things for me as a human being and as a survivor right now. First of all, you reminded me to reset my time limits on Instagram, which I got deleted when my phone updated, because it's a space that can be, it's just like everything in life. It's not black and white. Everything exists in the gray. Instagram can be such a supportive space, but it is also a space I go to when I want to dissociate, when I'm overwhelmed with the world and things that are going on in my own life. So that was the first reminder. And the second one was to reach out to a friend. This week has been just horrific in the world, and sometimes things just come together and you just have a bad week. And so you just reminded me to reach out to a friend, to set a time to go see a movie this weekend and have dinner and talk and connect and be in community, because so often it's easy to isolate yourself when you're feeling for myself at least, it's easy for me to start isolating the second I feel like I need support. So tactile, very tangible things. Thank you so much. And now I want to shift a little bit from the community aspect to these sort of conversations that we have inside of ourselves. As survivors who are often encouraged to share their stories. So much of community change and impact comes from survivors sharing their stories and what we've experienced and the traumas that we've endured. But we're told to do that without a lot of support. There's not a lot of support in place for survivors who are told to speak out. And I wanted to know, from your perspective, Do you have any opinions or thoughts on the systems and mechanisms that should be in place for survivors who want to share their stories in either a storytelling format, and how to make those spaces truly trauma and survivor informed?
And that is such a big, important question. And I think for starters, as a society, we really need to stop demanding survivors share their stories and just intimate, details of their trauma for maybe just maybe getting a chance of support or justice. Um, and as you mentioned, without the infrastructure for supporting these survivors. And I think it's really insidious how society demands survivors speak out, tell their stories, but then they gatekeep and cherry pick, what whose stories we hear, whose stories are supported. And I think that needs to change. I think that there needs to be more spaces for authentic storytelling. And we need to look at whose stories are being told traditionally, white cis women. And creating spaces for we need to create spaces where there's so much misinformation and disinformation, especially online, that it makes it even harder for survivors to share their stories. It's unfortunate where it almost seems like disclosing abuse has like turned into consent to strangers online, like dissecting your story and turning it into content. Um, I'm part of an initiative called Survivor Stories Deserve Better, which is a standard of call for survivor informed journalism. Because the way we talk about trauma and abuse online is actually a public health crisis, and it impacts the ability for survivors to be able to share their story or speak out about their experiences. And I think that is also a really important, component of this is the language that we use. It's not, the language that we use. Survivor stories aren't entertainment, and we all too often see it exploited for profit. And so much of that needs to change. It needs to be prioritizing survivor safety and survivor voices.
And I also wanted to highlight the writing workshops that you've created and offer for survivors as well. And wanted to ask you just for a sneak peek of what is, I get this question a lot too from people who are like, well, what was it like writing your story? What was it like sharing it in the form of a memoir? And how do you suggest I start? So I'd love to get your opinion on how do you suggest people start sharing their stories, especially in the form of writing?
I would say a reminder that you are the expert. There's no right or wrong way to tell your story. Um, also, show yourself some grace. We don't inherently have the language to express to even ourselves what happened. And it makes it take some time and some experimenting to find that language and craft those narratives. Um, so be kind to yourself as you put language to your experiences. Um, what advice would you give? Because I generally want to hear that if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I just wrote so much in my diary during everything that was happening. So I started from there, but honestly, I'm not the best person to ask that question to either because, we had my co-author Jen and I had 3 months to write this memoir together. I was 18 years old and we were moving. I had just graduated high school. We were slowly losing furniture in the house. Jen and I finished the book writing on the floor of our living room with no carpet, no couches, and but it also was an interesting process because we were still in the middle of civil litigation as well. So my book became something that was highly fought over from my school's attorneys, and we had to end up sharing an early draft with them. And but I would say that nothing in life happens in a vacuum. There's always something else going on that will lead to hiccups in whatever you're trying to do. I would encourage people, and I have been encouraging people in anything that they do, to center into yourself. What do you truly want? And that was one of the things I did at the beginning of starting the writing process, was with my therapist. I said, my head is all over the place. I've got so many things that I want to share with people, but I don't know what the purpose of that is yet. And so we sat together and came up with 3 things that I wanted people to understand from my story, or to feel from my story. And that was really helpful to focus in on the essentials, and then figure out what I was willing to share with people beyond that. But I guess my advice would be to find a mentor or somebody that you can really trust to help guide you, because it's hard to go through anything alone, including writing.
I would say, listen, don't give advice unless asked for advice. Um, Learn about the impacts of trauma and the realities of abuse. Be patient, set boundaries as needed, continue to show up, follow through on commitments, don't make promises you can't keep. Be prepared to listen to things more than once. um, Aim to practice collaborative and transparent communications, um, and respect and value survivors' agency. They are the decision maker for themselves. Um, and ask the survivor. They may not know, but it's always nice to be asked.
The other very special thing that you do is that you also create trainings on a variety of topics, but the one that I find the most interesting is building online communities for survivors. And so I would love to hear if someone listening wants to build a safe online space like the one that you've created and the one that we're constantly trying to create. What are a few foundational principles you want them to begin from day one doing and creating?
So many things come to mind. I'll try to narrow it down. Um, Creating creating safety plans for both the survivors as well as the staff, the folks running the online communities, setting realistic goals. It can be really helpful to ask, what do I want to accomplish by creating this social media platform? Who's my audience? Is it local, statewide? Is it global? And, what is your organization group's metric for success? That can also help determine your goal. And the last couple of things I would say is, being honest about how much time and resources you can realistically allocate towards social media. Even if you have just a little bit of time, you can still make a big impact, but it will depend, that will help impact how you want to set things up. And, think about what considerations and commitments can we make towards accessibility, especially online, adding alt text, image descriptions, captions, making sure that that's a core part of your plan.
And to the survivors who might be witnessing these groups online, seeing them be formed, but might not be ready or feel ready to join a community yet, but at the same time are still craving that connection and community, what would you say to those survivors, or how would you help them feel comfortable, or know when they feel comfortable enough to join a community, or contribute to a community?
Um, that is such a relatable feeling. I mean, I think that, at the core of trauma, it's the wanting to connect and also wanting to isolate and fighting between the two. It's very much like, look at me, don't look at me. um, and I feel that so much, even as a survivor, going into other communities or some days wanting to engage with MTMV community. Um, and that, well, first off, sometimes we're not ready, and that's okay. And it doesn't have to be I'm not going to participate. And then the other option is I'm going to join every community, every group. There are spaces in between, getting to familiar with different spaces, seeing what, makes you feel even just a little bit more comfortable. Uh, you know, Maybe reaching out to, the community leader, group facilitator, you know, trusting your instincts, which I know for survivors can be really, really hard. Um, and I think it's okay to say, I'm not completely comfortable or ready, but maybe I'm going to try this. And it's okay to walk away, to close your computer. Um, you are in charge, and you get to decide if it feels right or if you're ready. As far as MTMV community and events, I always try to answer all my DMs and emails. So if you do have any questions, I'm here to answer them.
If you imagine the future of survivor informed care, say 10 years from now, what do you hope will be fundamentally different in how we talk about and respond to sexual violence?
That we listen to survivors, that would be a great start. Um, that survivors aren't shamed and blamed. Um, that they are met with culturally responsive wraparound support, that survivors are respected and valued.
And then, since we're nearing the end of our time, how can our listeners connect with you and support the work that you do with MTMB Community Support Network? And just what would you like them to know, whether they're survivors themselves or supporters wanting to learn more?
That you matter, you know, there's no right or wrong way to be a survivor. We're all doing our best. And that goes for supporters as well. Um, you deserve support too. Um, I am here and I care. You can find MTMV on Instagram and threads at MTMV Community. You can find me online at the Survivor Informed Advocate, and have a lot more information about MTMV, different resources, recorded events at mtmvsupport.com. Come say hi.
Yes, I hope that if everyone listening doesn't already follow you, I hope that they, as soon as they're done listening to this podcast, that they immediately follow you and become a part of the community. So I know that the world can feel really heavy, especially lately with everything going on in the news. But we try to end each episode with two questions. And the first is, what is giving you hope? So even with all the craziness and the heaviness, what are the things that you're looking to that are making you feel hopeful?
First off, my dog, shout out to Donut Fritter. um, Honestly, this may sound cheesy, but you all and, different survivors organizations, groups that, every day get up and say, yeah, things are bleak, but I'm still here. Um, Maybe going to take a little nap, but we're going to get back up and we're going to keep doing this work and knowing that I'm not in it alone. So thank you for being here and for doing all that you do and for giving me and so many help.
And the second question that we like to ask all of our guests is, our organization is called I Have the Right To. I came up or introduced the I Have the Right To hashtag in 2016 when I came forward publicly, and would love to hear what that statement means to you and what your I Have the Right To statement would be today.
Oh, no pressure. That's like such a good question. I have the right to be me. I feel like for so much of my life and so much with my trauma, folks try to put me in a box or silence me or even myself, looking down on certain parts of myself. And, I'm amazing. And even in the parts that, still need more nurturing and care. And I have the right to be me and all of my wonder and all of the things I'm still working on.
Well, that is beautiful, and I'm so glad that you are you. Um, who you are is beautiful and impactful and making a difference. When you said that, it reminded me, I try to have my kids every once in a while look in the mirror and say, I'm brave, I'm strong, I'm kind. I think we forget to do that for ourselves as well. And so a reminder with that I have the right to statement to everybody listening to do that for yourself as well. Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your honesty, and the care you bring to this work. Conversations like this remind us why Aspire exists in the first place, to hold space for nuance, for truth, and for the kind of community that makes healing feel possible.
I especially appreciate the way that you talk about community as justice, because so often the legal system is not justice. And thank you so much for introducing the terms of survivor enforced care to our audience today and giving the language to what so many people are feeling but might not be able to name yet. We're so grateful for the work that you do and the example that you set as well about showing up with both boundaries and compassion.
And a huge thank you to Maria and Kylie for co hosting with us today. We are so proud to have your voices as part of this conversation and as part of the I Have the Right to community.
And to everyone listening, if today's episode resonated with you, we invite you to share it with someone in your life who might need it. These conversations grow stronger when more people are willing to learn. And if you're looking for ways to bring these conversations into your school or community, I Have the Right to partners with K-12 schools, colleges, and universities to provide trauma-informed programming on consent, healthy relationships, and leadership. You can reach us at takeaction@ihavetheright2.org.
You can learn more about Lauren and the MTMV Community Support Network in our show notes, along with ways to connect and support her work. And as things can feel very heavy lately, I'd like to leave you with this reflection. What is your I have the right to statement? What is the boundary, the truth, the hope, or the future you are claiming for yourself and your community? Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about safer communities, and thank you for doing your part to build them. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at ihavetheright2.org.